What would drive an experienced emergency room nurse to transfer departments after just one shift? What kind of case could be so disturbing that it would haunt someone for months afterward? In today's story, you'll discover what happened during my most devastating night as an ER nurse at Metropolitan General Hospital, and why the Morrison family will forever be etched into my memory. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to help us reach our next milestone. Leave a like if this story resonates with you and comment below with your thoughts. Now settle in and listen carefully, because what I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about medical emergencies and family tragedy. There are certain moments in healthcare that fundamentally change how you view your profession. Moments when the clinical training and emotional detachment you've carefully built over years of practice suddenly crumble in the face of something so profound that it reshapes your entire understanding of human suffering. I experienced such a moment on October 14, 2022, during what started as a routine Friday night shift in the emergency department of Metropolitan General Hospital. My name is Sarah Collins, and I'd been working as a registered nurse in emergency medicine for 9 years before that night. I had seen countless tragedies walk through our doors: car accidents, overdoses, domestic violence cases, heart attacks, strokes. I thought I had developed the thick skin necessary to handle whatever crisis came next. I prided myself on maintaining professional composure while providing compassionate care to patients and families during their worst moments. Metropolitan General is a Level 1 trauma center serving the greater Portland area, a 400-bed facility that handles over 85,000 emergency department visits annually. Our ER consists of 32 treatment bays arranged around a central nursing station, with specialized areas for trauma, cardiac emergencies, and pediatric cases. The department operates with controlled chaos most nights, but Friday evenings are particularly intense as we deal with the influx of weekend injuries, accidents, and medical emergencies. That October evening began like any other. I arrived for my 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift and received report from the day nurse, Jessica Martinez. The department was moderately busy with typical Friday night presentations. We had several motor vehicle accident victims, a few alcohol-related injuries, some chest pain cases, and the usual assortment of minor traumas and medical complaints. The charge nurse that night was Linda Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had an uncanny ability to manage the organized pandemonium of our emergency department. Dr. Michael Rodriguez was the attending physician, someone I had worked with countless times and trusted implicitly for his clinical judgment and calm demeanor under pressure. The team felt solid, experienced, and ready for whatever the night might bring. At approximately 9:47 p.m., the radio crackled with an incoming ambulance report that would change everything. Paramedic Unit 23 was transporting a family involved in a house fire. 3 patients, 2 adults and 1 pediatric, all with varying degrees of smoke inhalation and burn injuries. Estimated arrival time was 12 minutes. House fires are among the most devastating emergencies we encounter in the ER. The combination of thermal burns, smoke inhalation, and carbon monoxide poisoning creates complex medical scenarios that require immediate, coordinated intervention from multiple specialists. But what made this particular case different wasn't the medical complexity. It was what we would learn about this family's story once they arrived. Linda immediately began coordinating our response. She assigned me to Trauma Bay 3 for the pediatric patient, while Dr. Rodriguez prepared to oversee the entire case. Our respiratory therapist, Mark Stevens, set up multiple ventilators and breathing equipment. The burn unit was notified, and additional nursing staff was called in to assist with what we anticipated would be a prolonged and intensive resuscitation effort. As we waited for the ambulances to arrive, I mentally prepared myself for what we were about to encounter. Burn victims require specialized care protocols. Pain management becomes critical immediately. Fluid resuscitation must be calculated precisely based on body surface area affected. Airway management is often complicated by smoke inhalation injuries. But beyond the medical aspects, burn cases are emotionally challenging because the injuries are so visible, so devastating to witness. The first ambulance arrived at 10:02 p.m. The paramedics wheeled in a 34-year-old woman named Rebecca Morrison. She was conscious but in obvious distress, with second-degree burns covering approximately 25% of her body, primarily on her arms and legs. Her face was covered with soot, and she was coughing persistently from smoke inhalation. But what struck me most was her eyes. Years of emergency nursing. Anything I had witnessed in narration I saw there was unlike the absolute terror and deaths my babies, she kept repeating through her oxygen mask. Where are my babies? Are they okay? Please tell me they're okay. The second ambulance arrived 3 minutes later with Rebecca's husband, David Morrison, age 36. His injuries were more severe. Third-degree burns on his back and shoulders, significant smoke inhalation, and early signs of respiratory distress. He was semi-conscious and required immediate intubation to protect his airway. As Dr. Rodriguez worked to secure David's breathing, I could hear Rebecca crying from the next bay, still asking about her children. The third ambulance was delayed. Radio traffic indicated complications at the scene, but details were sparse. All we knew was that a 7-year-old patient was still en route with what paramedics described as critical injuries. The uncertainty was agonizing. Rebecca Morrison's pleas for information about her children became more desperate with each passing minute. "Please," she begged Linda Thompson. "I need to know if Emma and Tommy are okay. The fire started so fast, I couldn't find them in the smoke. David tried to go back for them, but the ceiling collapsed. Please tell me someone got them out." It was then that Linda gently explained what we knew. Tommy Morrison, age 7, was being transported to our facility with severe injuries. Emma Morrison, age 4, had been found by firefighters but was not responsive. She was being taken directly to Children's Hospital across town, where pediatric specialists could provide more appropriate care for her critical condition. The moment Rebecca processed this information, her anguish transformed into something I had never witnessed before. It wasn't just grief or fear. It was the complete psychological fracturing of a mother who believed she had failed to protect her children. Her cries echoed throughout the emergency department, cutting through the usual sounds of medical equipment and urgent conversations. David Morrison regained consciousness briefly after his intubation and immediately began trying to remove his breathing tube, desperate to speak. When Dr. Rodriguez explained that his daughter was at Children's Hospital and his son was being brought to our facility, David's vital signs became erratic. His blood pressure spiked dangerously and his heart rhythm became irregular. The combination of his physical trauma and emotional shock was threatening his cardiovascular stability. At 10:23 p.m., the final ambulance arrived with Tommy Morrison. What I saw when those doors opened will remain with me for the rest of my life. The 7-year-old boy had suffered extensive burns over 60% of his body. His condition was critical, requiring immediate transfer to our trauma resuscitation bay. But beyond the severity of his injuries, it was Tommy's awareness that made this case so devastating. Despite his pain and trauma, he was conscious and calling for his parents. "Mommy, Daddy?" he whispered through his oxygen mask as we transferred him to our treatment bed. "Where's Emma? Is Emma okay?" I looked across the trauma bay at Rebecca Morrison, who was being treated just 20 feet away. She could hear her son's voice, could see the medical team working frantically to stabilize him. The expression on her face as she watched her critically injured child was something that transcended normal human emotion. It was raw, primal maternal agony that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of her being. Dr. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to sedate Tommy immediately to manage his pain and prevent further trauma from his awareness of the situation. As the medications took effect and Tommy's questions about his family faded into unconsciousness, I realized that this case was going to test every aspect of my professional and personal strength in ways I had never anticipated. The next several hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Tommy Morrison required immediate surgical intervention to debride his burns and begin the complex process of wound management. The pediatric burn surgeon, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, arrived within 30 minutes and quickly assessed that Tommy would need multiple surgeries over the coming weeks if he survived his initial injuries. His prognosis was guarded at best. Meanwhile, Rebecca Morrison's emotional state continued to deteriorate, despite our attempts to provide updates about both children. Every few minutes, she would ask the same questions. "How is Emma? Can I see Tommy? When can I hold my babies?" The repetitive nature of her questions revealed the psychological shock she was experiencing. Her mind seemed unable to process the magnitude of what had happened to her family. David Morrison's condition stabilized enough for him to be extubated around midnight. His first words were identical to his wife's concerns. "My children. I need to see my children. I should have gotten them out first. This is my fault." The guilt consuming both parents was as visible as their physical injuries, and arguably more devastating to witness. What made this case particularly haunting was learning the details of how the fire had started. The investigation revealed that a faulty electrical outlet in the basement had sparked a fire around 9:15 p.m. while the family was watching a movie together upstairs. The house's older construction meant the fire spread rapidly through the walls, filling the home with smoke before the family even realized what was happening. David Morrison had managed to get Rebecca out first, then attempted to return for the children. Tommy had been found near the STD bin discovered in her bedroom, overcome by smoke and air case, apparently trying to reach his parents. Emma halation before she could escape. The firefighters worked for 18 minutes to resuscitate her at the scene before rushing her to Children's Hospital. By 2 a.m., we received an update about Emma's condition that would forever change how I understood human suffering. The 4-year-old had suffered severe brain damage from oxygen deprivation during the fire. She was on life support, and the pediatric neurologist indicated that her chances of meaningful recovery were virtually non-existent. The medical team at Children's Hospital was recommending that the family consider end-of-life discussions. I was present when Dr. Rodriguez delivered this news to Rebecca and David Morrison. The moment those words registered, something fundamental broke inside both parents. Rebecca's grief transformed into a keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human emotion. David, despite his own critical injuries, attempted to get out of his hospital bed, pulling at his IV lines and monitors in a desperate attempt to reach his daughter. "She's only 4 years old," Rebecca sobbed. "She was going to start dance class next month. We bought her new shoes, pink ones with little flowers. She was so excited." The specificity of these details, these tiny fragments of a normal life that had been obliterated in minutes, made the tragedy even more profound. Tommy's surgery concluded around 3 a.m. with mixed results. Dr. Chen had successfully addressed the most critical burn areas, but Tommy would require extensive skin grafting and months of rehabilitation. His survival remained uncertain, and even if he did recover, he would face a lifetime of physical challenges and psychological trauma from this night. As dawn approached, I found myself struggling to maintain the professional composure that had served me throughout my nursing career. The Morrison family's tragedy wasn't just another medical emergency. It was a complete destruction of everything that had defined their existence just hours earlier. They had been a normal family watching a movie together, and now they faced losing both children while dealing with their own severe injuries. What haunted me most was witnessing the exact moment when hope died in their eyes. Rebecca Morrison spent hours asking about Emma, clinging to any possibility that her daughter might recover. When Dr. Rodriguez finally explained the extent of Emma's brain damage, I watched Rebecca's face change as she processed that her 4-year-old would never wake up, never dance, never call her mommy again. David Morrison's response was different, but equally devastating. He became completely silent, staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute defeat. When nurses tried to engage him about his own treatment plan, he would simply nod without really listening. It was as if his spirit had left his body along with his children's future. The emergency department continued operating around this family tragedy, but the Morrison case affected every staff member present that night. Nurses who had decades of experience found themselves taking extra breaks to compose themselves. Dr. Rodriguez, normally unflappable during medical crises, was visibly shaken as he coordinated care between multiple specialists and facilities. Around 5 a.m., we received word that Emma Morrison had been declared brain dead. The decision about removing life support would need to be made by her parents, but given their own injuries and emotional state, that conversation would have to wait until they were more stable. The cruelty of forcing parents to make such decisions while dealing with their own trauma and their son's critical condition seemed almost unbearable. I realized that night that some cases transcend medical treatment and enter the realm of pure human suffering that no amount of clinical training can prepare you to witness. The Morrison family's tragedy forced me to confront the absolute randomness of devastating loss and the limitations of what medical professionals can actually fix or heal. As my shift neared its end, I looked back at the trauma bays where this family's world had collapsed. The blood had been cleaned up, the equipment reset for the next emergency, but the emotional residue of what we had witnessed lingered in every corner of that space. Some tragedies are so complete, so devastating, that they leave permanent marks on everyone who witnesses them. The Morrison case taught me that being an emergency nurse means more than managing medical crises. Sometimes it means bearing witness to the complete destruction of human lives and finding ways to continue providing compassionate care even when hope itself has died in front of you. The days following that shift blurred together in ways I had never experienced before. I found myself unable to sleep, replaying every moment of the Morrison family's arrival. The sound of Rebecca's voice calling for her babies echoed in my mind during quiet moments. Tommy's whispered questions about his sister haunted my dreams. But it was the silence that came after, when hope finally died, that affected me most profoundly. I returned to work 3 days later, but something fundamental had changed in how I approached my job. Every pediatric case that came through our doors triggered memories of Tommy Morrison's burned body and Emma's absence. Every parent's worried expression reminded me of the absolute terror I had seen in Rebecca's eyes. The emotional walls I had built over 9 years of emergency nursing had been completely demolished by a single family's tragedy. Dr. Rodriguez noticed the change immediately. During a brief lull between patients, he pulled me aside near the medication dispensary. "Sarah, I know the Morrison case affected all of us, but I'm concerned about how you're processing what happened. Have you considered talking to someone about it?" I assured him I was fine, but we both knew that wasn't true. The clinical detachment that once allowed me to function effectively during medical crises had been replaced by an overwhelming emotional vulnerability that made every case feel personal. When a 6-year-old came in with a broken arm from falling off his bike, I found myself holding back tears as I thought about Emma Morrison, who would never ride a bike again. The Morrison family remained in our hospital for 2 weeks following that initial night. Tommy underwent 3 additional surgeries to address his burns, each procedure requiring him to be sedated and intubated again. I volunteered for extra shifts just to monitor his progress, telling myself it was professional dedication, but knowing it was something deeper. I needed to see him survive. I needed something positive to emerge from this devastation. Rebecca Morrison's physical injuries healed relatively quickly, but her psychological state remained fragile. She spent every possible moment at Tommy's bedside, reading him stories even when he was unconscious from surgery. She had brought a small collection of his favorite books from home, somehow salvaged from the fire. The pages were singed around the edges, and the smell of smoke clung to them, but she read from them anyway. "Tommy loves this one about the brave little mouse," she told me during one of my visits to his room. "Emma always said the mouse looked like her stuffed animal, Mr. Whiskers. We haven't found Mr. Whiskers yet. Maybe he's still in the house somewhere." I didn't have the heart to tell her that nothing remained of their home except charred framework and ash. The fire had consumed everything they owned, every photograph, every memento, every physical connection to the life they had built together. But watching Rebecca cling to these damaged books as she read to her unconscious son, I understood that hope sometimes manifests in the smallest gestures. David Morrison's recovery was more complicated. His burns were healing, but the emotional trauma had triggered severe depression that required psychiatric intervention. He blamed himself completely for the fire, even though investigators confirmed it was caused by faulty electrical wiring that predated their ownership of the house. Logic had no power against the guilt consuming him. "I should have checked the electrical system more carefully when we bought the house," he told me one afternoon when I stopped by his room. "I should have installed better smoke detectors. I should have practiced fire escape plans with the kids. I failed them in every way possible." The irrationality of survivors' guilt was something I had encountered before, but David Morrison's self-blame was absolute and devastating. He spoke about Emma in past tense, as if she were already gone, even though she remained on life support across town. This acceptance of his daughter's fate, combined with his terror about Tommy's prognosis, had created a psychological prison that seemed impossible to escape. On October 28th, 2 weeks after the fire, Rebecca and David Morrison made the decision to remove Emma's life support. I wasn't working that day, but Linda Thompson called to let me know. The family had held a small ceremony in Emma's hospital room, with Tommy being transported there in a wheelchair so he could say goodbye to his sister. Tommy was conscious by then, though heavily medicated for pain, and somehow understood what was happening. "I told Emma I would take care of Mommy and Daddy for her," Tommy had whispered to his parents after Emma's machines were turned off. "I promised her I would be brave like the mouse in the story." The funeral service for Emma Morrison was held on November 2nd at a small church near the hospital. I attended, along with several other nurses and Dr. Rodriguez from our emergency department. The service was devastating in its simplicity. Emma's favorite pink dress, the dance shoes Rebecca had mentioned that first night, and photographs showing a vibrant 4-year-old who loved butterflies and ice cream. Tommy Morrison attended his sister's funeral in a wheelchair, his burns still visible beneath carefully applied bandages and protective clothing. He sat between his parents during the service, holding both their hands, somehow understanding that his role in the family had fundamentally changed. At 7 years old, he had become their reason to continue living. Rebecca Morrison spoke during the service, her voice barely audible above the sound of crying from the small congregation. "Emma taught us that love doesn't end when someone dies. She would want us to take care of Tommy and help him grow up strong and happy. That's how we honor her memory." But I could see in Rebecca's eyes that surviving Emma's death was requiring every ounce of strength she possessed. The guilt of being unable to save her daughter, combined with the fear of losing Tommy to infection or complications from his burns, had created a constant state of emotional crisis that no amount of counseling or support seemed able to address. The Morrison case forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of medical intervention. We had saved Tommy's life and treated David and Rebecca's physical injuries successfully. From a clinical perspective, the case could be considered a partial victory. 2 out of 3 family members survived and would eventually recover from their injuries, but witnessing the complete destruction of this family's emotional foundation made me question whether survival was always the ultimate goal. Tommy Morrison would live, but he would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of his life. Rebecca and David would continue breathing, but they would never again experience the simple joy they had known before October 14th. 3 months after the fire, I made the decision to transfer from emergency nursing to the hospital's outpatient clinic. I told my supervisors it was for professional development opportunities, but the truth was that I could no longer handle the constant influx of human tragedy that defined emergency medicine. Every ambulance call, every family crisis, every moment of watching people's lives collapse in real time had become unbearable. My last shift in the emergency department was on January 15, 2023. Dr. Rodriguez organized a small farewell gathering in the break room, and several colleagues shared memories of cases we had worked together. But everyone understood that my departure was really about the Morrison family, about how some experiences fundamentally change who you are as a healthcare provider. The Morrison case affected all of us, Linda Thompson said during my farewell, but you took it deeper than the rest of us. Sometimes caring too much becomes a professional liability in emergency medicine. She was right, but I didn't regret the emotional investment I had made in that family's tragedy. Witnessing their suffering had taught me things about human resilience and the nature of loss that no medical textbook could convey. Sometimes, the most important learning happens when our professional defenses completely fail. Tommy Morrison was discharged from the hospital in February 2023 after multiple skin grafts and extensive rehabilitation. He would require ongoing medical care and psychological support for years to come, but he had survived against significant odds. His recovery became a source of hope for the entire medical team that had cared for his family. Rebecca and David Morrison eventually moved to a different state to start over, seeking distance from the memories and community connections that made their grief more difficult to bear. They sent a thank you card to our emergency department, expressing gratitude for the care their family had received during their darkest hour. But gratitude felt inadequate to describe what we had shared with this family. We had witnessed the complete destruction of their world, and somehow found ways to continue providing medical care while their humanity was being torn apart. The experience had bonded all of us in ways that transcended normal professional relationships. In my new position at the outpatient clinic, I work with patients who have chronic conditions requiring ongoing management rather than emergency intervention. The pace is slower, the emotional stakes generally lower, and the patient relationships more longitudinal. But the Morrison family remains with me every day, influencing how I approach every patient interaction and every family conversation. The lessons from that October night weren't just about medical trauma or emergency nursing protocols. They were about the absolute fragility of human happiness and the ways that random tragedy can obliterate everything we think we understand about our lives. They were about the difference between surviving and living, and the complex ways that grief reshapes every aspect of human existence. Sometimes I wonder about Tommy Morrison, whether his burns healed properly, whether he started school again, whether he still thinks about his sister Emma every day. I hope his parents found ways to rebuild some version of happiness, though I suspect their joy will always be tempered by the absence of their daughter and the memory of that terrible night. The Morrison case became the lens through which I viewed every subsequent patient interaction. But it also revealed something darker about the healthcare system that I hadn't fully understood before. In the weeks following Emma's death, I began noticing patterns that had always existed, but somehow escaped my attention during 9 years of emergency nursing. Insurance companies questioned every aspect of Tommy's extensive treatment plan. Rebecca and David received bills totaling over $800,000 within the first month, despite having what they believed was adequate coverage. The family's financial devastation compounded their emotional trauma in ways that seemed deliberately cruel. "We're going to lose our house anyway," David told me during one of his follow-up appointments. "The fire took our home, and now the medical bills are taking everything else we own. Sometimes, I think it would have been easier if none of us had survived." This wasn't an isolated sentiment. I had heard similar statements from other families facing medical bankruptcies, but the Morrison case made me realize how the business of healthcare often conflicts with the healing mission we're supposed to serve. Tommy needed specialized burn care, psychological counseling, and reconstructive surgeries that would span years. The family's insurance company fought every recommendation, requiring endless documentation and appeals for treatments that were obviously necessary. Dr. Chen, Tommy's pediatric burn surgeon, spent hours each week arguing with insurance representatives who had never examined the child but felt qualified to determine which procedures were medically necessary. The bureaucratic battles delayed Tommy's care and added administrative stress to his parents' already overwhelming burden. "The insurance company wants us to try cheaper alternatives first," Rebecca explained to me one afternoon while Tommy was receiving wound care. "They suggested we consider treatments at a clinic 2 states away because it would cost them less money. How am I supposed to leave Tommy for weeks at a time when he's already lost his sister?" The systemic failures extended beyond insurance coverage. Social services became involved because Tommy would need extensive home modifications to accommodate his physical limitations during recovery. The family's temporary housing didn't meet requirements for medical equipment, but finding appropriate accommodations while dealing with their own injuries and grief proved nearly impossible. Rebecca Morrison called me crying one evening in November, 3 weeks after Emma's funeral. "They're saying Tommy might have to go to a residential treatment facility because we can't provide adequate care at home. Sarah, how can they threaten to take my only surviving child away from me? Hasn't this family suffered enough?" The threat of family separation added another layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. Tommy had survived life-threatening injuries and lost his sister, and now faced the possibility of being removed from his parents during his most vulnerable period. The psychological impact on a 7-year-old child was impossible to calculate. I found myself making phone calls on the Morrison family's behalf, connecting them with social workers who specialized in medical cases, helping them navigate the complex web of services and requirements that determined whether they could remain together. This advocacy work wasn't part of my job description, but the Morrison case had blurred every professional boundary I had previously maintained. Linda Thompson noticed my involvement extending far beyond normal nursing responsibilities. "Sarah, you're taking on emotional labor that isn't yours to carry. This family's problems are bigger than what any individual nurse can solve." She was right, but I couldn't detach myself from their ongoing struggles. Every phone call about denied insurance claims, every meeting with social services, every setback in Tommy's recovery felt personal, because I had witnessed the moment their world collapsed. Their pain had become intertwined with my own sense of professional purpose. The breaking point came in December when Tommy developed a serious infection at one of his graft sites. The specialized antibiotics he needed weren't covered by his parents' insurance plan, and the family couldn't afford the $3,000 monthly cost out of pocket. Rebecca Morrison called me sobbing. explaining that they were considering selling her wedding ring to pay for Tommy's medication. "My grandmother's ring is the only thing that survived the fire," she told me. "It was in the jewelry box on my dresser, somehow protected by the metal. It's all I have left of my family history, but Tommy needs those antibiotics. What kind of mother am I if I choose a piece of jewelry over my son's health?" That conversation crystallized everything wrong with how we approach medical care in crisis situations. A family that had lost everything was being forced to sacrifice their last remaining connection to happier times because our healthcare system prioritized profit over healing. The moral bankruptcy of this situation was more devastating than any medical emergency I had encountered. I contacted a pharmaceutical company representative who had visited our hospital recently, explaining Tommy's situation and asking about compassionate care programs. After 3 days of phone calls and paperwork, we secured the antibiotics at no cost to the family. Tommy's infection cleared within 2 weeks, but the stress of nearly losing access to life-saving medication had pushed Rebecca into a severe depressive episode that required psychiatric hospitalization. The Morrison family taught me that some cases transcend medicine and enter the realm of human tragedy that reshapes everyone it touches. Their story revealed the fragility of the lives we're sworn to protect, and the limitations of what compassion alone can accomplish when systems fail the most vulnerable. Today, I carry their memory not as a burden, but as a reminder that healing extends far beyond treating injuries. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply bearing witness to suffering and refusing to let it be forgotten.